Thank you very much, and thanks to everybody for being here. And you're going to get a more cheerful lecture from me today than you usually do, but I'll fix all that on Wednesday. I think it is clear to members of this audience that we in Canada and the United States and Western civilization are in a heap of trouble these days. And it's somewhat odd that we should find ourselves in the kind of mess that we do. Because, in the 19th century, and up to the First World War at least, it was very plausible to believe that history had ended, and had ended in a good way. And I want to talk about that partly because a general premise of these conferences, as far as I have experienced them, though not of my spoilsport contributions, is the tremendous advances in human affairs that have supposedly taken place since the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. And this, in my view, among other things, creates a puzzle as to how everything could have gone so wrong in the 20th and into the 21st centuries. And as those of you who've been at previous conferences and didn't fall asleep during my presentations, and I know somebody told me they'd brought a pillow, so I guess that isn't the entire audience. But you know that one of the things that I often do is challenge this notion that the end of the Middle Ages was a great relief to all concerned and represented a resurgence of reason and good sense in human affairs with brilliant results. And this is part of my ongoing effort in a spirit of well-meaning naivete to start a religious war. So stay tuned. But for this evening, I want to talk about how reasonable it was to believe 120, 140, 150 years ago that this promise of secular progress in human affairs, this relief of the human condition here in the here and now, really had been fulfilled, that we had found the answers to the big problems that had vexed humanity from the word go, and that there was just a limited amount of mopping up left to do. And in the Victorian era, this was, I think, a very credible way of looking at the world. Peace, plenty, and political liberty were in the process of being perfected. So when they go, "Are we there yet?" it was quite reasonable to say, "Yes, we're there. Stop asking." And obviously, one of the problems that we have nowadays is petty bureaucratic tyranny, though it's not the main one. But I mention it because I always get these slides which require me to make a full disclosure. And the essence of my disclosure is that I have not yet figured out how to leverage an Augustine College summer conference speech for dishonest advantage. I'm working on it. But yeah, I think they're going to pay me. And as my father once said, if you think that's unreasonable, you can try and get your money back, but not from me. I have not yet found a way to be on advisory boards. Patents, my ideas belong to me, but no one wants to steal them anyway, least of all the politicians. Financial relationships, blah, blah, blah. I don't know who got all of this. Ask the organizers. Not as much as we want. And again, conflicts of interest, just not getting there. It's terrible. I am going to prescribe liberty, Magna Carta, and Christianity, but I don't think I'll make any money off that. And I've made no effort to mitigate my bias in favor of liberty, truth, and Christ. And on we go. So, and there's nothing on plagiarism there. So, but I should tell you I plagiarized this speech from one of my lectures to Augustine College, which is partly because those of you who come here and support the college might be curious to know what we do. You may be horrified to find out, but fair enough. You're going to get a bit of a look at what goes on, at least in my classes. And if you were thinking of enrolling or sending someone to enroll, you'll either be more determined to or absolutely have a change of heart once you see what I've got to say here. Oops. And if this were in fact the class, I have to give this Marshall McLuhan jest here. I can't believe Marshall McLuhan said something funny, but he really did. Time is not the same for the speaker as for the audience. To the speaker, it is too brief for what he has to say. For the audience, it is a grim foretaste of eternity. And since I enjoy the sound of my own voice quite a bit, I'm going to try always to bear that in mind. Knowing the people who are here, I don't think my boring you into catalepsy would be a taste of eternity as usually experience it, though possibly you're enemies. But then I noticed as I was just bringing up the PDF to give the talk, the stupid AI thing that you can't now get away from said, "This appears to be a long document. Save time by reading a summary." Yeah. So, having gotten that out of our way, from the point of view of the 19th century, one of the things that seems to have happened is that the long struggle against absolutism, which was quite feverish and scary looking in the 18th century and up through the final defeat of Napoleon at Waterloo, seems to have been won. In particular, resurgent absolutism, even in Britain, was defeated, first in the American Revolution and then in Britain. And in the US Capitol, they actually have a gold replica of Magna Carta, which was gifted by the British Parliament to the American Congress on the 200th anniversary of the American Revolution. And this, I think, is an extraordinary gesture in its magnanimity and its humility of saying, remember that little unpleasantness? Well, you were right. We had lost our way. Thank goodness you recalled us to our good senses. And again, this long history of the kind of problems that engaged William Pitt the Elder in the 18th century, these dynastic wars. There's a long Monty Python sketch in which people at a party are talking about the intricacies of 18th century European politics while being robbed periodically of all their possessions. And I've never had the heart to play the clip for my audiences, and I won't do it to you either. But it's funny because the people in Monty Python were well educated. They did know about this stuff, but the intricacies of Prussia and Brandenburg, and it's just a nightmare. But it looks as though we're done with that nonsense. Napoleon is defeated, Britannia rules the waves, the United States is policing the Western Hemisphere, liberty and free trade are enshrined, the Royal Navy is stamping out the international slave trade, and one of the weirdest things about that is that the Americans are helping them, even though the United States is still a country with slavery. But you figure that all of this is vanishing from the stage of history. Tyranny, oppression, smooth, inevitable progress to the Crystal Palace and beyond. And when I teach history, one of the things I warn my students right at the beginning is to be aware of the fact that they've seen the back of the book. They know how it turns out. They know the kinds of things that are going to happen. And this creates two dangers. One is the danger of assuming that everything that happened was inevitable and therefore should have been clear at the time. And the other one is to take for granted things that ought to surprise you. You do have to look through history for the kinds of things that drive it, for causal forces, for probabilities, but don't assume it had to happen that way. I mean, one classic example, the Germans very nearly did win World War I in 3 months, and how different would life be today if they had? But just because the war turned into the meat grinder that it did doesn't mean that it had to. On the other hand, there are very good reasons why it did. And so, of course, you all know that this bright, uplit land of late 19th century Victorian England is going to plunge into the abyss, and we're going to get both world wars and Hitler and all the kinds of things, from Islamism to deconstructionism that plague us today. But from the Battle of Waterloo to the Guns of August, there is almost exactly a century, again, in which it really does seem that we have arrived. And this was not an illusion. One of the things, it's funny, when I teach the history of Western civilization, the first term gets us to the end of the Middle Ages, and it's kind of a story with a single trajectory. And then we get to the second term, and the lectures alternate between disastrous and reassuring and disastrous and reassuring. And this is one of the reassuring lectures. But again, the fact that it didn't go the way they thought it was going to doesn't mean the whole thing was a house of cards, that it never could have, and that they were idiots. to feel otherwise. This world where progress seems smooth, inevitable, and benign is the world of Sherlock Holmes, and it is a very appealing world. I wish they'd been right. There's this, whoops, stop. You must not continue. This poem about here dwell together still two men of note who never lived and so can never die. How very near they seem, yet how remote, that age before the world went all awry. But still the game's afoot for those with ears, attuned to catch the distant view halloo. England is England yet for all our fears, only those things the heart believes are true. A yellow fog swirls past the window pane as night descends upon this fabled street. A lonely hansom splashes through the rain, the ghostly gas lamps fail at 20 feet. Here, though the world explode, these two survive, and it is always 1895. And those were the good old days. And I mean, there obviously you can point to things that were wrong, but it was not an illusion that Victorian England was, in many ways, the finest civilization that had ever existed, and seemed to promise that things would keep getting better, including that freedom seemed to have no real rivals. Germany is a horde of feuding principalities, despite this Bismarck person. Italy's a mess beyond redemption. Spain is a walking corpse, like Austria-Hungary. The French have been defeated and will not be back. This isn't a matter of the English thinking that wogs start at Calais. It's that it seems to be increasingly clear in practice, as well as in theory, that nations flourish or fail depending how successfully and enthusiastically they embrace Western liberalism. And again, France is the big cautionary tale at this point in history. When its balloon bursts externally and internally, it's a huge told you so from across the English Channel that tyranny is stupid. And it's interesting to reflect because of all the bitterness of the wars between England and France. I don't know if you know this, but in a number of the memoirs of men who fought on D-Day, as they were approaching the beach, unbidden, it came into their heads that speech from Henry V about "we happy fewy band of brothers," which is incomprehensible to people today, but also it's a bit odd because, of course, Henry V at Agincourt was fighting the French. And here these guys are going to fight with the French against the people who've conquered them. But in some ways, France was the most westernized place outside the Anglosphere in the 17th and 18th centuries. And it was also the one big threat to England and to the, if you want to look that far, the United States, right? Obviously, Spain had shot its bolt. The Ottoman Empire was another walking corpse. And everyone else isn't even getting to the point where if they collapsed, you'd notice that it had happened. There's sort of immobile tyranny in most parts of the world. In France, immobile tyranny erupts into bloody revolution that goes incredibly fanatically wrong, proving once again that the English are best, by producing Napoleon, who lost, and then Napoleon III, prompting that crack about history repeating itself as farce. And of course, people talk about the First World War, but in a lot of ways, the First World War was the 7 Years' War, in which the dastardly, absolutist, arrogant French and their stupid allies were beaten by the English. And again, when I ask my students if they know where the Black Hole of Calcutta comes from, it turns out they don't know what the Black Hole of Calcutta is. But it was a place where English people were put in India by allies of the French. It's the sort of thing the French would get themselves tangled up with. And this victory is the end of all this stupid stuff like the War of the Spanish Succession, the War of Jenkins' Ear, the War of the Austrian Succession, the War of what the heck's going on here. And, the British win all of this, and they get names for battleships like Ramillies for the Duke of Marlborough's incredible 1706 victory over Louis XIV's generals, and the combined Franco-Spanish Bavarian. You've got that pillow, right? So I won't go on with this, but the point is there's a lot of idiot stuff that goes on, including, by the way, the Duke of Marlborough was John Churchill, a name you might recall from history, and the English win. And eventually it becomes kind of a joke, right? In British mothers, if their kid won't go to bed, they say, Boney's going to get you. So Bonaparte has become this kind of thing for scaring 7-year-olds. In the United States, they think all of this stuff is such nonsense that they call them just Queen Anne's War and King William's War. The Americans don't really identify with Britain's struggles closely again until 1941. But anyway, the 7 Years' War is also a dull name. It ends with the Treaty of Paris. One day I'm going to ask my students to identify and explain the Treaty of Paris and watch them burst into tears. But it also brings the Plains of Abraham, which we can't talk about, and we force democracy on the Quebecers who've never forgiven us. And again, there's a lot that I could say here if I weren't trying to save time by reading a summary, including one of the very strange things, and it's partly just coincidence, but between the coming of the Bourbons to the French throne in 1589, when Henri IV decides Paris is worth a mass, and the coming of Robespierre in 1789, the French have only 5 kings. That's not a lot. For some reason, the French kings live a long time. And oh, there's the Sun King. Oh, yes, Le Roi Soleil, with his shapely legs, at least once filtered through a court painting. And Louis XV, who you may have thought was a chair, but he wasn't, and who supposedly said, "Après moi le déluge," unless that was his mistress who said it. And by the way, if you're fans of the Second World War, you may know of the RAF Dam Busters Squadron, the ones with the famous bouncing bombs to destroy the dams on the Ruhr. That was their regimental slogan, which I think is marvelous. But those two alone cover nearly a century and a half. Louis XV, who dies when he's 64, was Louis XIV's great-grandson. And one of the things I don't envy the French about studying their history is that everybody's either called Henri or Louis. You know, at least the English, every time they change dynasties, they switch names. And in this same period, England has 11 kings, 3.5 dynasties, and an interregnum. Right, Elizabeth I, James I, Charles I, Oliver Cromwell, Charles II, James II, William and Mary, and George I, George II, George III, who may or may not have gone so mad as to call an oak tree the Tsar of Russia. And you also get the Regency, Beau Brummel, everyone drinking Hogarth gin, pretty debauched. And then William IV pulls himself together, outlives his brother, and Victoria takes the throne. Hooray. Upper lips stiffen. And by the way, another of my little God is a libertarian pet peeves, in England in the Victorian period, everybody had a gun. Everybody had a gun. Sherlock Holmes whips out a gun at the slightest provocation. Watson's always putting a revolver in his pocket. And the authorities are not asking them why they have weapons. And Watson doesn't shoot Mrs. Holmes or the reverse. And nobody in Britain, including Sherlock Holmes, can imagine a greater compliment that the palace is pleased with what he has done. Meanwhile, in France, you've got Robespierre. No thanks. And the French eventually realize that they shouldn't be a stupid monarchical tyranny, so they become a stupid revolutionary tyranny and execute everybody, and blood flows in torrents, and they can't figure out checks and balances. And this once again drives home the point, not just that liberty works, but that the time-tested, pragmatic, improvised, it works so don't mess with it, British system of creating liberty is the only one that works. And by the way, I just found this out from Tristan Hopper in the National Post. You know, when the king goes to deliver the throne speech in the British Parliament, he's a special room in which he puts on his crown, and featured on the wall is a framed copy of the death warrant of Charles I. So that's a little pointed. But all the stuff with the gentleman usher of the black rod, this goes back to 1642, and it should. And so I won't get into all that went wrong in the French Revolution. The Committee of Public Safety should still make the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. And one of the interesting things about the French Revolution, of course, is that on paper you have a lot of rights. The Declaration of the Rights of Man says no man may be indicted, arrested, or detained, except in cases determined by law and according to the forms which it has prescribed. But of course, they guillotine everybody, including Robespierre, because it's easy to call and hard to run, as Kenny Stable used to say. And France has problems with civil society, and at one point they create a whole new calendar, which again is one of these warning signs, like when they start renaming cities. But renaming the calendar is even worse, and they create a new era that lasts 12 years, and they rename all the months with stupid names like Frimaire and Nivose, meaning frosty and snowy, Pluvose, meaning rainy, Ventose, meaning windy, you know. and they create a 10-day week and blah, 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 blah. So all of these are things the British would never have done. Hip, hip, hooray. Obviously, the British are best. And if anybody wants to build a decent society, they should be like Britain. And of course, you realize that when French revolutionary politicians and people fall from power, they flee to England for safety. So it's like everybody knows it, even the French. They may be unable to get their act together, but as Tennyson said, but they have liberté, égalité, fraternité, death, and the British have Queen Victoria. And I mean, the French Revolution goes so bad they are literally making lamps out of human skin. This really does happen. One Olympia de Gouges in 1791 publishes a Declaration of the Rights of Women, and 2 years later they behead her. It's an astonishing nightmare. And then again, you get Napoleon, who crowns himself, also not good. And then he does this thing with the hand inside the jacket, and becomes a subject of endless mockery in the Anglosphere because the English laugh at everything. And they can't quite figure out how to do elections or anything else. And by the way, I was looking up French Empire, and this was the first one I found. And I was looking at this and thinking, wait a minute, where's West Africa? But of course, this was back in the sort of Habsburg days. The French put together an empire. It didn't work. They got Napoleon III. It didn't work. And if you cross the channel from Napoleon III and his almost disastrous intervention in Crimea, and then his disastrous intervention in the War of 1870, what are the British doing? Well, they're building railroads. And one of the reasons that they build the London Underground, apart from the fact that they've invented the railway, is that the Thames is an open sewer. The Thames is so bad, as a matter of fact, that when Parliament burns down in 1834, again, as you may know, in Canada, Parliament burned down in 1916, and even that was derivative. But it was laboriously rebuilt, but when the MPs moved back in 1851, the stench was so bad they could barely conduct their business. And then there was the Great Stink of 1858, and they actually soaked the curtains in lime chloride, which may not sound to you like the end of history. But, of course, what happens is they go, well, this won't work. We better build the cloaca maxima of the 19th century. And between 1859 and 1875, they do. They build this massive sewer system. They stop Londoners from fouling the Thames, and they create the Crossness pumping station, which is a Romanesque architecture. It's opened in 1865 by the Prince of Wales. And they've got engines named Victoria, Prince Consort, Albert Edward, and Alexandra, all made by James Watt and Company. And other royalties show up, plus the Lord Mayor, the Archbishop of York, and Canterbury, a banquet for 500 people in the station, which operates for the next 100 years. And the engineer who did it all, Joseph Bazalgette, gets the Order of the Bath. And I figure after 15 years cleaning the sewage out of London, he may well have needed one. They also bricked over the Fleet River. So the Fleet Street, the home of British journalism, was in fact an open sewer, which didn't change, but you can't have everything. And of course, the tube is still iconic. Like, in Ottawa, we got light rail because all the cool kids have train sets, and it's been a disaster that only Canada could really have imagined. But that's subway system, right? Complete with the circle line and so on. And of course, also, you shouldn't have to ask. And again, you look at this, who's the most famous detective in French culture? Yeah, je ne sais pas, even in American, or maybe it's Jacques Clouseau, right, who of course is British. In America, maybe it's Sam Spade. I'd vote for Nero Wolfe. But anybody who hasn't heard of Sherlock Holmes just hasn't heard of detective stories at all. And of course, it's also the case that in this period, partly because of the shock of the American Revolution, right, the British realized in the middle of the war that the colonists had been right and they were wrong, that the king had gotten out of control, that taxation without representation was being implemented, that sort of thing. And so in the 19th century, you get this high noon of Parliament. Ministries fall, sometimes without triggering a general election. Government shrinks to about 10% of GDP in Britain. Property rights are secure, including, as I said, the right to bear arms. Nobody's freaking out at the Sherlock Holmes stories because of the fact that there are guns all over the place. The British have a stiff upper lip and can be trusted with firearms, and they don't trust their government, and if it gets on their backs, they will shoot it. And that's just taken for granted. And, Britain doesn't even have compulsory schooling until 1870, right? The country that launches the Industrial Revolution, that rules the waves, whose economy, whose culture, whose way of life are a beacon to the world, have an empire on which the sun never sets, and they don't even have compulsory schooling. They don't need it. The British educate their kids. They're a free people. And it's sad to think that once upon a time made in Britain was the ultimate in quality. And of course, again, part of what makes all this work is that the British have a spirit of ruthless self-criticism that is absent in most of the world, but is certainly present elsewhere in the Anglosphere. My high school history and English teacher made us memorize this one. When Kareem of Nineveh from distant Ophir, rowing home to haven in sunny Palestine, with a cargo of ivory and apes and peacocks, sandalwood, cedarwood, and sweet white wine, some of which you'll recognize, of course, as biblical. And then you get the stately Spanish galleon coming from the isthmus, dipping through the tropics by the palm green shores, with a cargo of diamonds, emeralds, amethysts, topazes, and cinnamon and gold moidores. d'ors. And then you get the modern day dirty British coaster with a salt cake smokestack butting through the channel in the mad March days, with a cargo of tine coal, road rails, pig lead, firewood, ironware, and cheap tin trays. This is also the guy who wrote I Must Go Down to the Sea Again, much parodied in the Goon Show. But whatever you think of that, and whatever you might think nowadays about the coming of headless robot cheetahs and machine guns and various other technological horrors, the fact of the matter is that after the American Revolutionary War, the loss of much of their first empire, the British go back to building a better empire and an economy that's absolutely world-beating. Maybe the cheap tin trays are a little cheap, but everybody gets them, right? The prosperity for the ordinary person in Britain by the late 19th century is unlike anything the world has ever seen before. And I mentioned the Crystal Palace because this is their Wonders of the Steam Age, this marvelous exhibition that was put on in 1851, and then it was moved in 1854, and it burned down in 1936, but, can't have everything. They set this thing up in Hyde Park, and over the 6 months that it's in operation, more than 14,000 exhibitors come from around the world, 990,000 square feet to show off technology. It's 1,851 feet long, interior height's 128 feet. It's 3 times the size of St. Paul's Cathedral. Sheet glass made it possible to produce these large, strong panes affordably. This is the greatest area of glass ever seen in a building. Visitors were astonished. It didn't need internal lights. And by the way, it still has the dinosaurs. Please do not try to identify the species. For that, we can only apologize. But at least they tried. Conan Doyle's The Lost World even fascinated Hollywood. And when I was a kid, the dinosaurs still stank, right? Dumb, lumbering, couldn't even stand up, the kind of creatures. But this was part of the mentality of progress. Dinosaurs were a long time ago, so obviously they were no good. Things just keep getting better and better and better. And finally you get us. Hooray. And by the way, at this exhibition, Samuel Colt of Colt 45 fame astonished people by bringing a bag of revolver parts, dumping them out on a table, and then just assembling a bunch of guns. And the reason this amazed people is that the symbol of the workman in the Bolshevik Revolution is a hammer, because things were not made so they just fitted effortlessly together. You had to bang on until they fit. But Americans were developing this mass production of interchangeable parts that was so precise, they just went together like IKEA had come early. And in 1851, this year of the exhibition, Great Britain smelted 2.5 million tons of iron. That's 5 times as much as the United States, 10 times as much as Germany. British steam engines could produce more than 1.2 million horsepower. That's more than half of all of Europe. And by this point, they have 5,000 miles of railway lines, Stagecoaches are going out of business. They've put toilets in Windsor Castle. Thank you very much. The toilet paper was not perforated until 1894, apparently. All kinds of things happened, cylindrical clay pipes. But also, in 1847, a 10-hour act sets the workday for people 13 to 18 and women at 10 hours. It's like, okay, that seems kind of harsh, right? But not compared to not having one. And another thing, when I teach the course, I of course put things up on the board that the students then have to be able to identify and explain on their exams. And one of them is La Semaine Anglaise, the English week, as it's called on the continent, which is a 5.5-day work week with a day off and a half day off. And so one of the results of all this enlightenment, political liberty, and prosperity is that people are not forced to work relentlessly 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. All of this looks absolutely like the end of history. By 1819, it's a common law maxim that the people of England have a property in their own goods which are not to be taken from them without their own consent, which of course is no taxation without representation. The monarch can no longer refuse to dissolve Parliament if the Prime Minister asks him to, or dissolve it if he doesn't. Between 1832 and 1868, 8 ministries are defeated in the Commons and immediately resign or get a dissolution and then lose in the ensuing election or vote. You really have a kind of fluid politics responsive to the people without a giant bureaucracy, without rigid party discipline. As you work your way through the 19th century, they extend the franchise. Though one sarcastic and prescient observer called the 1832 Reform Bill an act to give everybody everything. So as Samuel Warren kind of saw that there was a peril here. But it's absolutely astonishing. You know, everybody gets middle-class prosperity and clean living and cricket, and they play the game. And again, British culture dominates the world the way Coke and Elvis and rap later will. In America, people line up at the dock to get the latest installment of whatever Dickens is writing. And even Russia has a liberal revolution in 1905. London is clearly the center of the world. Catholics are emancipated. And all of this stuff, again, it looks like we've just gotten there. By the way, Queen Victoria once famously said, "That book, the Bible, accounts for the supremacy of England. England has become great and happy by the knowledge of the true God through Jesus Christ." And one of the things that's actually happened in England in the 19th century, we tend now to think of Victorians as stuffy. Well, maybe you don't, but one does. But England in the 18th century was kind of debauched, and not least because one of the things the Industrial Revolution did was produce gin on an industrial scale. And then you get William Wilberforce and his 2 crusades, right? Wilberforce, as you know, was determined to end slavery, and he did. But he also wanted a reformation of manners, by which he did not mean don't look in your handkerchief after you blow your nose. He meant stop gambling, stop going to prostitutes, stop all the terrible things you're doing, and start to live as though you took the Bible seriously. And there's a huge Christian revival in Britain in the early 19th century, and people really do change their ways. Not everybody, not all the time. The original sin is not abolished. But the British really do become religious. In the 19th century, it is religious books, including books of biblical exegesis, that are bestsellers. Theological tracts and sermons far outsell novels. And there are lots of intellectual controversies that are very much centered on religion. One of the things that comes out of the Industrial Revolution is 20,000 new churches, the greatest physical memorial of the age other than the railways. And when John Henry Newman became Catholic, Gladstone said, "I regard Newman's conversion as an event as unexampled as an epoch." And Disraeli said, "This conversion has dealt a blow to England from which she yet reeled." I do not think if a British Prime Minister were to convert to Catholicism today, it would cause any notice, nor, I frankly suspect, would it lead to them behaving in such a way that you'd be able to tell if they hadn't told you about it. One of Canada's proud traditions is Roman Catholic Prime Ministers who support abortion and medical aid in dying. And so the church is able to restore the English hierarchy in the mid-19th century. All kinds of these things happen, and you say, okay, Jews get the vote, and people are kind of like, oh, Jews. But there's obviously no stopping progress, and progress ends with individual liberty, prosperity, happiness, and peace. And by the way, illegitimacy, births out of wedlock, as they were once quaintly called, they're now just called babies. It was a bit lower in France than the UK in 1800, but by 1900 in France, it was almost 9%, more than double the English rate. And in Paris, by the way, it was almost 33%. In Stockholm, 46%, and Vienna, 49%. As Gertrude Himmelfarb commented, Victorianism, it is evident, was peculiarly English, or perhaps Anglo-Saxon. One can speak of Victorian America, not Victorian France. And at the same time that the British are doing all this, they rule the world, economically, militarily, and culturally. Obviously, it works, and everybody else either has to get with the program or remain a sort of comic bad example. And I mentioned Tennyson. I'm not good with poetry. If I read it, I don't know what's going on, but anyway, I'm going to read you some poetry, because I did finally decide I'd better read the works of Tennyson, and it was a slog, but I'm sure it was good for me. "Look there, a garden," said my college friend, the Tory member's eldest son, "and there, God bless the narrow sea which keeps her off, and keeps our Britain whole within herself. A nation yet, the rulers and the ruled, some sense of duty, something of a faith, some reverence for the laws ourselves have made, some patient force to change them when we will, some civic manhood firm against the crowd. But yonder, whiff, there comes a sudden heat. The gravest citizen seems to lose his head. The king is scared. The soldier will not fight. The little boys begin to shoot and stab. A kingdom topples over with a shriek like an old woman and rolls down the world in mock heroics stranger than our own. Revolts, republics, revolutions, most no graver than a schoolboy's barring out. Too comic for the serious things they are, too solemn for the comic touches in them. Like our wild princess with as wise a dream as some of theirs. God bless the narrow seas. I wish they were a whole Atlantic broad." And that, although it might seem to foreigners to be a bit pretentious, is not an unreasonable sentiment. Tennyson looks at the way they do things in England, and he looks at the way they do things elsewhere, and he says, we've solved the puzzle. And in Canada, we got a constitution that is similar in principle to the British, even though it's written down in federal, and theirs is neither, because it's about liberty under law, a sovereign people whose rights cannot be infringed, small government. And if you look at our founding debates, which this being Canada were not actually published until 1999 by some dissenting right-wing kooks, it's extraordinary because someone will stand up in one of the legislatures and say, "Preserve your British liberties, confederate." And someone else will stand up and say, "No, preserve your British liberties, do not confederate." But nobody out there doubts that we have British liberties and that they're incredibly valuable, including Joseph Howe, who is the real father of self-government in Nova Scotia. But before that, he's a newspaper publisher, and he's forever berating the colonial administration for corruption, and finally he gets tried for libel. And in British law at the time, truth is not a defense. So in his summing up, Howe turns to the jury and he asks them, "Will you permit the sacred fire of liberty brought by your fathers from the venerable temples of Britain to be quenched and trodden out on the simple altars they have raised?" And the jury says no. They acquit him. They nullify the law as unfit for a free people. And this is an extraordinary phenomenon. Imagine a politician in Canada today talking like this. They wouldn't dare to. They couldn't get the words out. And if they did, they'd be laughed off the stage. Sacred fire of liberty? Good heavens. But back then, this was just the way people thought about the problem. And by the way, in 1840, Howe was actually challenged to a duel by the son of the colony's chief judge for his reporting. And the son of the judge missed, and Howe fired his pistol into the air instead of shooting at him. And then we had a comic opera revolt in demanding self-government, but the British just threw in the towel because they didn't believe in repression anymore. And so there's not going to be a repeat of 1776, there's not going to be a repeat of 1781, and God save the Queen. And then Australia gets self-government in 1900. There wasn't a fight of any sort. We had a couple of people killed in Lower Canada, aka Quebec. It was about 100, and some got deported. But it was not like the American Revolution, because the British had learned their lesson, and not just about the practicalities, but about the fact that the liberties of Englishmen were not to be infringed even by London, thinking it knew best. And again, because this document is long, we'll save time by reading a summary. But there is a very strong understanding, and it was true here in Canada as well, that Parliament did not govern. That we sent MPs to Ottawa, and in the British case, they sent them to Westminster, to stop the administration from infringing their rights. And that was the job of members of Parliament, not to empty the Treasury out the window into our pockets as quickly as possible, though, as Samuel Warren warned, this would in fact happen. So what on earth went wrong? And of course, a lot of things go wrong. One of this, it starts small, but as Egg Shen says in Big Trouble in Little China, it always does. But if you haven't seen this movie, it may not be to your taste, but it is one of the more extraordinary films ever made. It's a martial arts spoof, supernatural thriller, comedy, action film starring Kurt Russell. And I can't just put it up on the screen. So they bury Charles Darwin in Westminster Abbey, and possibly this is where all the trouble starts. But I think it goes back further. But one of the problems is that part of the reformist spirit of the age, posing as harmless, is utilitarianism. But utilitarianism, because it believes in the greatest good of the greatest number, it doesn't believe in natural rights. And while the programs appear to coincide for a long time, ultimately utilitarianism is going to burst its bonds in quite a sinister way. And in some sense, it all happens very quickly, but we're not there yet, and I don't intend to get there until Wednesday, so I will not go further on this one. But I want to quote John Quincy Adams. You know, the Americans had two Adams as president, of both of whom it was said that they were the man perfectly suited to unite the nation against himself. So they get kind of a bad press, though John Quincy Adams apparently could write Latin with one hand and Greek with the other, which maybe some people thought was laying it on a bit thick. However, I digress. In his first State of the Nation address to the House and Senate, he wrote, "While dwelling with pleasing satisfaction upon the superior excellence of our political institutions, let us not be unmindful that liberty is power. That the nation blessed with the largest portion of liberty must, in proportion to its numbers, be the most powerful nation upon earth." Now, if that's true, and I actually believe that it is true, that's great news, right? Because it's always seemed as though freedom is a blessing domestically, but unfortunately the tyrants can get their act together and summon mighty armies and disregard popular opposition to war, wring cash out of their populace, and then attack you while you're just busy making sewers or something. But John Quincy Adams is arguing with the example of Britain and then the United States in mind, that actually liberty makes you strong. And so freedom is its own defense. Well, that's a happy ending, right? That's a lot better than having Napoleon cross the Channel or Philip II or one of these clowns. And as Alexis de Tocqueville says, the English colonies, and this is one of the chief reasons for their prosperity, have always enjoyed more internal freedom and more political independence than those of other nations. So even some French people are starting to get it. And again, Britain acquires an empire, and nowadays, of course, boo, down with the British Empire, it's terrible, it stinks, etc., etc. But you compare the British Empire with any other powerful organization that has ever existed on this earth, even the Roman Empire, but certainly, the Russian Empire, or the Mongol Empire, any of these horrifying things. The British Empire shows up, and it spreads literacy, it stamps out widow burning, it abolishes the slave trade, it builds railroads and sewers. And forgive me if I've told you this one before, but it is worth repeating. In 1841, the governor of the Northwest Province, what eventually becomes part of Pakistan, is preventing the burning of widows. And a bunch of Brahmins come to him and say, "This is settler colonial oppression. You are interfering with our customs and you should not do this. Who do you think you are?" And the governor says, "Oh no, I'm as good a multiculturalist as anyone, and I propose that you continue to burn widows, because you always have, and we continue to hang anyone who sets a woman on fire, because we always have." And that's the end of Suttee. And you'd have to be a pretty hardcore Indian nationalist to say, oh, that was bad. Or even to say, we were about to. They'd still be doing it if it weren't for the British. And so, and this is the empire we think of as the British Empire. And, of course, it's easy to poke fun at the flags of a free empire showing the emblems of British power throughout the world. But it really was, in the eyes of the people who built it, and not without reason, the template for human fulfillment and for decency everywhere. That the British did things better. I mean, whoever stamped out the slave trade, even in their own territory? The British stamped it out in other people's countries. They spent blood and treasure getting rid of the slave trade across the ocean. That is quite an extraordinary thing to have done. And for instance, I like this story. This is from Niall Ferguson's book, Empire. The Reverend Carl S. Volkner came to New Zealand in the 1850s, but fell out of favor with the Opatiki Maoris by urging them to desist from bloodshed when war broke out with a rival clan in 1865. One of the Opatiki chiefs shot him, decapitated him in his own church, drank his blood, and swallowed both his eyes. Well, different strokes for different folks, I guess. But it's kind of hard to defend, right? When they celebrate native traditions and use the word vibrant, that's not what they're thinking of. And then here's something from Rudyard Kipling. In a scene in which a Central Asian chief asks a native officer of the British Empire, how can they have such an orderly parade review? How do they manage their affairs? And the officer says, there was an order and they obeyed. But are the beasts as wise as the men, said the chief? They obey as the men obeyed. As the men do. Mule, horse, elephant, or bullock, he obeys his driver, and the driver his sergeant, and the sergeant his lieutenant, and the lieutenant his captain, and the captain his major, and the major his colonel, and the colonel his brigadier, commanding 3 regiments, and his brigadier his general, who obeys the viceroy, who is the servant of the empress. Thus it is done. Would it were so in Afghanistan, said the chief, for there we obey only our own wills. And for that reason, said the native officer, twirling his mustache, your emir who you do not obey must come here and take orders from our viceroy. And again, although one could easily make fun of this stuff, one shouldn't lose sight of the fact that there is a very important truth in there about the fact that the British way of doing things wasn't just so the British could get rich. I mean, the British didn't go to Afghanistan to steal stuff. There was nothing to steal. The British way of life was better for everybody. It was the proper way that people ought to order their affairs, and to the extent that they did, they prospered and stopped having stupid wars. Liberty of the press. This isn't coming from anywhere else. Personal freedom of the subject. And again, there's more Tennyson, but time is short, so I won't read it to you. But he's talking about the fact that if England has a terrible climate, and he says, if it ever becomes despotic, I'm heading for the South Seas on the next boat. But as long as England is free, I will stay here. And again, it crosses the ocean to the United States, where Americans eat meat in quantities that astound Europeans, and then have an industrial revolution of their own with textiles and steamboats and mechanized agriculture and newspaper printing. And one immigrant, Francis Grund, reported, business is the very soul of an American. He pursues it not as a means of procuring for himself and his family the necessary comforts of life, but as the fountain of all human felicity. It is as if all America were but one gigantic workshop, over the entrance of which there is the blazing inscription, no admissions here except on business. Well, okay, that's not strictly true, and of course they had a civil war, partly because it was not strictly true, but then... And one of the strange things about the American Civil War, by the way, is that if you look at the statistics of American industrial production and so on, and the Civil War killed something like 1 in 5 white Southern men of military age. This was a very bloody affair. And if you don't know it, by the way, the English Civil War killed more Englishmen per capita than the First World War did. But nevertheless, the American Civil War is a blip on its drive to industrialization, urbanization, and also, of course, large-scale immigration. In the latter part of the 19th century, the Americans bring in millions of people from places that are just totally squalid. And in America, where they're given freedom and room to be themselves, they flourish. in the most astonishing way. And the Americans, by the way, among the many things they invent is the mass-produced house. If you're a fan of the cartoonist Charles Addams and his sort of ghoulish cartoons, like this one of the Addams Family, Greetings and Carolers, the houses depicted would have been sold as kits, delivered by a railway and banged together following the numbered guide. And they were not perhaps of the highest quality, which is why they get kind of this dilapidated quality by the time Charles Addams is drawing this. But, the Statue of Liberty, right? The Statue of Liberty is another of these things like Sherlock Holmes that everybody recognizes. Love it, hate it, it's a wonder of the steam age. People are fascinated by how it's made. It exceeded in height the Colossus of Rhodes, and people certainly knew that. Excuse me. And then you get Emma Lazarus's poem that gets added to it to raise money for the construction of a pedestal, with that line about, give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless tempest-tossed, to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. And of course, it's amazing what happens to people when they come to America. I mean, my ancestors, the hillbillies, right? Bad news, right? And if you read the Steel Bonnets, like that, on the Anglo-Scots border, these are people you would really want to send to Northern Ireland to beat up on the Catholics, which is in fact what the English did with a lot of them. But they come to America and they become a huge and successful part of its culture. The United States, with its nobody's better than anybody else, call them by their first name, slap the pastor on the back, and live in mobile homes and deep fried peanut butter sandwiches, exuberance. Or the incredible number of Jews who come to the United States when the Russian Empire turns even more ferociously anti-Semitic, just at the time that railways and steel ships have made passage across Europe and then across the ocean affordable even for poor people. The way in which Jews in America flourish and what they add to the national life, all of this is an absolutely extraordinary tribute to the fact that it appears that we got it right. And again, as I say, everybody knows the Statue of Liberty. I think I have a shot here somewhere of Chinese protesters, and they create a goddess of liberty, and it is really, really not hard to figure out what they think it looks like. So all of this feels like we're not going to have World War I, right? We're not going to have the Holocaust. We're not going to have nuclear weapons. We're not going to have the Iranian Revolution. We're not blah, 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 blah. But of course we are, and you all know that we are. And so in some sense, I may seem to have just been telling you a Sherlock Holmes story, which is great fun, but alas, fictional. But it's not. All of this was real. All of this speaks to what happens when you unleash human potential by guaranteeing the rights of the ordinary person, by securing them against oppression, by protecting free thought, by protecting free speech, by lifting, slowly and painfully perhaps, but by lifting all those ancient legal limits on the rights of people, whether minorities or majorities, to live their lives as they see fit, provided they do not use force or fraud against their neighbors. And again, you can point to problems at the time, including that the cheap tin trays are not Louis XV chairs. But on the other hand, who has a Louis XV chair other than a bunch of people who don't actually do anything useful for their country? And then I like to frighten the students, or attempt to, by pointing out that with the Industrial Revolution speeding up and speeding up and speeding up, you get into a situation that Karl Marx complained about, for once he nailed this one, about how all that is solid melts into air. And one of the books I make my students read that I think baffles them even more than a lot of what I say is Victor Davis Hanson's book, Carnage and Culture, where he explains how for 2,500 years in wars between West and non-West, there's been a casualty ratio of almost a steady 10-1, from Salamis to Rorke's Drift to the Siege of Hue in the Vietnam War. The Western way of life does everything better, whether it's worth doing or not, including war. But with the invention of invention, the Industrial Revolution producing more and more things at a faster and faster pace and always looking for the next big thing, you get Her Majesty's ship, Dreadnought. You have heard battleships called dreadnoughts, of course. Well, this is the Dreadnought. This is the name ship for the whole class. And when Dreadnought was produced in 1906 with the steel and petrochemicals and precision manufacturing, this wonder of the steam age, it immediately renders all other warships obsolete. And I don't just mean all the German ships. I don't just mean all the French ships, even the American ships, never mind, Austria-Hungary apparently started the First World War with some kerosene submarines. They're thinking, we can die in easier and less foul-smelling ways, right? But Dreadnought renders the British Navy obsolete as well. Nothing in the oceans can possibly match this ship. And so, of course, if anybody else could figure out how they did it and start building them, 500 years of British naval tradition count for nothing. And, of course, the Kaiser immediately does start doing this. Dreadnought was 527 feet long, 82 feet wide, and drew just over 29 feet, 23,000 short horsepower. I don't know what a long horsepower is. And it can go 21 knots, which is 24 miles an hour. So by our standards, of course, that doesn't really impress you very much, but at the time, this was just revolutionary. This absolutely scared everybody, and rightly so. And by the way, since I have a few more minutes to impose on you, I don't know if it has ever occurred to you to wonder why it is that in a Navy, the ship that is most likely to explode on contact, the one that the sailors will call a tin can, is known as a destroyer. Like, surely destroyer destroyed. But the reason for that is that one of the consequences of these new kinds of battleships was the development of these fast little torpedo boats, the German E-boats, that were going to dodge between the shells and blast it. And so they created E-boat destroyers, and that's why destroyers are called destroyers. That's of no particular relevance. What is of extraordinary relevance, though, is that Dreadnought entered into service in 1906. And of course, everybody did build the equivalent. In fact, the head of the British Navy in 1911 predicted confidently the coming of a general European war in 1914. And when he was asked how he knew, he said, that's when the Germans will complete the Kiel Canal and be able to get their dreadnoughts back and forth between the Baltic and the Atlantic. And so it was. But so fast is progress and this naval arms race that the only significant act Dreadnought ever performs in war is to ram and sink a submarine. Dreadnought is the only battleship confirmed to have sunk a submarine. By the time of the Battle of Jutland in 1916, the one big naval battle in the whole First World War, Dreadnought was being refitted because she was obsolete. She was relegated to coastal defense duties and reduced to reserve in 1919, sold for scrap in 1921. And that's just a small harbinger of the fact that what the Victorians achieved, dramatic and real as it was also turbulent. It was driven by a kind of dynamism that was very likely to shake the whole thing apart. And I don't just mean technological or material, though clearly that's part of the problem. There's an intellectual dynamism that parallels this economic and technological one, of ideas that consume themselves, and all that is solid melts into air, that truth is devoured, and chaos in the intellect produces chaos in the commonwealth. So I'm not going to dwell on that today. That's a dismal subject for 2 days from now. When we go from David Hume to Jacques Derrida in a nightmare ride that leaves Sherlock Holmes in the dust. But in addition to, it's not a conflict of interest if I just say, give me money, right? That's just fair enough. But again, it would be wrong to think that the 19th century was an illusion. The things I'm talking about are real and important, and if they could have been held onto, or if they can be gotten back, they are very much worth having. Abolishing the slave trade, yes, ask a slave, right? Real functioning parliamentary democracy, limited government, small budgets, property rights, the right to bear arms, freedom of worship, all of these things are important in principle and did exist in practice. And so therefore, For all that I'm going to say about the deep roots of radicalism and the problems in the modern world coming out of the Middle Ages, there is much that is true and beautiful in what was accomplished coming out of the Renaissance and coming out of the Enlightenment. The promise of the 18th century, in large measure, realized in the 19th century. Even the fact that the British built a sewer system that was the envy of the world. And remember, the last people to do that were the Romans. Rome could only exist because of the Cloaca Maxima. The Romans, they said, were better at drains than brains. But you know what? It's good to have drains. So all of this stuff is real and important. But it's also real and important that they weren't able to hang on to it. That a combination of inherent dynamics and historical accidents, including the assassination that starts the First World War, only happened because the Archduke's driver got lost. Or did it, right? Was it really, could it be that one idiot or two idiots, Gavrilo Princip and this chauffeur, could have caused this conflagration, or was it bound to happen? We're not going to get into that too far, but it brought down something wonderful. And I think it is important to see both sides of that. So that's why I give the students this happy lecture. And then if this were the course, it would be World War I next. Instead, we'll leapfrog that, but we won't ignore it totally. But we also will never forget that even if Sherlock Holmes never existed, Queen Victoria did exist. And the empire over which she presided was a marvelous thing, centered on a civilization that had reached an unprecedented and marvelous state. And that's it. I don't know how long I was actually meant to talk, but I think that was basically an hour. An hour and 4 minutes. So Marshall McLuhan would be pleased with me, I hope. Those of you who feel that damnation would be a relief after what you just sat through will take issue in the question period.
Hometown of Robson. I'm thinking, I'm bury that truth. Like, why are you?
And this is where Paul Potts stayed when he was at university. Right? Great. No, and there's a line I've never been able to track down. So I believe this is a true story, though, but a French composer or something who moved to England in the 19th century, and his friends horrified him, mon Dieu, how can you move to England? And he replied, well, for one thing, now I win the Battle of Waterloo. And I feel very sad for people, and this encompasses most of the human race, whose heritage is a bunch of rather improbable might-have-beens. Like even the French, right? When Notre Dame de Paris caught fire, and they're like, oh, it's the soul of France. It's like, aren't you all atheists? Like, what? You haven't got a soul. How could it be on fire? And you know, and there's a line from Chesterton at one point that you can't evaluate something until you know what it's for, right? You couldn't possibly judge a corkscrew until you knew that it was meant to open bottles. And then you might, if you were a teetotaler, say this is an evil thing or something. And you can't judge a cathedral till you know what it's for. And I don't think the French know what a cathedral's for. But if they did, what would they say? Was pre-revolutionary France a good and happy land and we shouldn't have ever done what we did? Was our system of government secretly good? It just looked pompous and greedy and inept. And then you compare France's government to that of, I don't know, Eastern Europe, and you think, please move to France. Because in France, there were more rights of people under feudalism than there would have been in, under the iron heel of the czars. And again, most of the world, when they try and dredge up some glorious history, it's preposterous. It's laugh out loud feeble, and you feel bad for yourself. I know you want to have something to be proud of. I know you want to say our ancestors did this and we can do that, but you're just making it up. And move to England or something and embrace Magna Carta as the universal heritage of mankind. And yet instead people are they're just so proud of things that you're.
We are proud. We were the first republic.
Sorry?
We were the first republic. We Dutch people. Well, before the first time.
Yeah, I mean, again, the Dutch are very much in the Anglosphere world. But you invented golf, though, which I think you shouldn't have done.
But we said, written
Yeah. But again, actually, it's funny. Had a second cousin once removed or something like that who was Dutch. And the reason that I had this relative was that his ship was at sea when the Netherlands fell in World War II. And they had a quick vote and they headed for England. Right? Because that's where you go when you're in trouble, is you go to England or you go to America. It's not that the Netherlands, had it been maybe bigger, would not have equally been such a place. But it's not an accident that the Canadians liberated the Netherlands in World War II, not the other way around. Because something magical happens in the English-speaking world. And again, there's a lot of interchange between the Netherlands and England. So in some sense, the Netherlands is a part of that world. But, everything from Magna Carta to the Gettysburg Address, it really is concentrated in one tradition. And the closer you are to that tradition, the more your history is admirable instead of embarrassing. And the further you are from it, again, I was just in Senegal, and there's a lot of, Jollof chicken and so on, because they once had a Jollof empire. But, no offense to anyone in Senegal, but the Jollof empire is not something to boast about. Not for its size, not for its power, not for its humanity. There's just, okay, you had an empire. So have hundreds of other people. And they trampled on their neighbors with little regard for the rules of human decency, and so did you. And you know it. And so it's just, and as I say, it's awkward, right? It really is. If you look at China and say, well, remember your golden age of liberty? Neither do I. Right? You never had one. China at times has been decently administered, but China has never been well governed. Italy, after the fall of Rome, it's hard to find a whole lot to celebrate there. But again, compared to, I don't know, the Ottoman Empire, if you were trying to find something good to say about the Ottoman Empire, where would you start? And the Ottoman Empire ends, incidentally, with the last jihad ever declared by a caliph. World War I is actually a jihad declared by the caliph against the enemies of Islam other than Germany. So they didn't actually think Germany was a friend, but that was, that was not, it's that line from the Lord of the Rings, we shall make an end worthy of a song, though there will be none left to sing it. The Ottoman role in World War I just doesn't fit that description, not even close. And that's tough, right? That really is tough. I mean, and again, if you think about even the people in this room, if you were to trace back our ancestry, it leads to a lot of odd places, but on the other hand, it brings us forward into this world. And I think I may have told this story before, don't stop me if you heard this one. But my father's family, as I said, are from the Lowland Scots, right? And the Scots have this insult for the English, Sassenach, which the English could care less about, right? Being insulted by the Scots doesn't strike them as a badge of dishonor. But it turns out that Sassenach is actually a Gaelic word, so from the Scots Highlands, meaning Saxon, and was originally aimed at the Lowland Scots. So apparently my ancestors at one point were these ferocious, barbarian, pagan, blood eagle types who came swarming across the North Sea with fire and sword, which isn't really a boast. Sort of, oops, sorry about that. But again, I mean, you just look at the names in the room and think of how many places the people here have come from, but they've all ended up in the Anglosphere. And that's a good place to be. And in some sense, I think India, with some difficulties, and it's a turbulent place because it's full of human beings, and you know what they're like. But India, in some sense, seems to me to be more and more solidly anchored in the Anglosphere. And I hope for their sake as well as ours that it is true. To have India a solid member of the Western Alliance with a functioning parliamentary democracy would be a great thing for the world. And again, and for Indians, it wouldn't be, we're so embarrassed because we have a parliament now and we didn't used to have a parliament. The idea, hey, you know what? We got a parliament and we kept it. That's something worth boasting about.
I was wondering about, just going back to the French, the ineptitude of the French, I guess, politically. Would you say, Montesquieu is very influential in the American founding, and I wonder if you consider him more of the Anglo, he's from Bordeaux, he's a Protestant, variety of features that may make him more English than French. But I mean, in point of fact, he's influential in checks and balances, all these kinds of things that we take for granted as Americans. I wonder where he fits. Why doesn't it catch on?
Well, that's the critical question, right? Because, I mean, at one point during the Revolution, the French had separated the powers so much that the judiciary couldn't strike down laws, because that would be infringing on the legislature's sphere of authority, meaning that they had it on paper, but in practice it didn't work. And by the way, speaking of the French, one of my middle names is French, because some of my ancestors, again on my mother's side, escaped from France with nothing but their own hides after the revocation of the Edict of Nantes. And we have these family records because I guess they kept their pride, but nothing else. They die in Charing Cross poorhouse one after another. So it's all we've got is XCC. But France lost so much talent there. And did I mention dragooning last time? Because both the English Bill of Rights and the American Bill of Rights are very pointed things to say about quartering soldiers. And one of the reasons why is the Edict of Nantes, which proclaims temporary religious toleration in France, specifies that this will only happen until the nation is religiously unified. And what the French government would do is it would send these dragoons, these soldiers, to live in Protestant houses and eat up the food and insult the family and molest the daughters. And eventually the family would run up the white flag and say, fine, we'll convert to Catholicism. They'd say, thank you very much, sign here, and they'd move to the next house. And that's how they got to the point that they had wiped out Protestantism, or at least appeared to have done, and then they revoked the edict. Well, I mean, that's dirty, right? That's just shameful. That is, you can't celebrate that in your history. And but what do you do with it? You can't pretend it didn't happen. And to give the French credit, when I was doing my documentary on World War I, we went to Compiègne, where that railway carriage is, that the armistice in World War I was signed. And then, of course, Hitler was kind of bitter about that. So when they defeated France in 1940, they came back and made them sign the surrender in the same railway car, which was eventually destroyed in the war. It's not quite clear how. And so then the French built an exact replica and recreated the memorial. And they say, and this is here to celebrate the events of 1918 and the moins glorieux, the less glorious events of 1940. And that's a bit of a euphemism, but they don't erase it from the history. They say, and this is where Hitler ground his Nazi boot right in our faces. And it happened here, and here's a film of it. So you see, the French are actually very westernized. They're more like the English than anybody else. And again, so that's partly why you have people like Montesquieu, right? The kind of thought that's going back and forth. I sometimes think the French are only democratic now because they couldn't put up with the jeering if they lapsed back into autocracy from that coming across the channel. They're sort of embarrassed into behaving themselves politically. But of course, and they've learned a lot from the English. And somewhere in their souls, they know that there's a reason why the British won the Second World War and they lost it. And it was to do with the British having a better way of doing things. So, there's some good French political theory, but the Declaration of the Rights of Man is just a failed attempt to have Magna Carta. And you look back before that at these firm declarations from everybody: the king's word is law, nobody can tell the king what he can or cannot do. And in England, it's like Richard II said, the law is in my mouth, and the Parliament said, how strange, you're dead. You couldn't get away with that in England 4 centuries earlier. And yet again, the French do a lot better than most people. You think about the rights of a peasant in France versus the rights of a peasant in Prussia. And again, just, keep going, and it just gets cascadingly worse. Because this stuff is hard to do. And again, that's part of why the British were proud of what they'd done in the 19th century. They knew it was hard. They knew it didn't happen normally, and they didn't have these delusions about, everybody's vibrant, everybody has these wonderful cultures. They weren't buying that for a minute. In my view, obviously they were right not to. They were doing things better than other people, and the results were tangible in the lives of the ordinary British citizen. It was, how do you look at Victorian England and not say to yourself, by golly, that's how it's done. That's everything we ever wanted, just about, is right there. Rights for women, yeah, we're working on that. Not perfect, but we are working on it. You know, rights for Jews, rights for Catholics, rights for non-whites. It's a work in progress, but it is in progress, and we're not going to stop till it happens. Prosperity for the middle class, a decent way of living for the poor, an enormous informal charity sector, just astonishing how much of that was going on. The reformers, I mean, Charles Dickens, obviously, is a huge audience. People read Dickens and they say, we got to do something about this, and then they go and they do it. I mean, even Bismarck at one point lamented the lack of civic courage amongst his countrymen, and obviously, you know, less than a century later, we saw how right he'd been. But it's one thing to see it, and it's another thing to get it. Like, again, Montesquieu could talk about checks and balances, but how do you put them into a political system where they don't exist organically? It's you know, a little bit, I think I quoted this in one of my talks a few years back, Ludwig Wittgenstein, that trying to fix a broken tradition is like trying to repair a spider web with your hands. To which my retort was, yeah, but at least they had a web, right? Imagine trying to do that with no silk. And that's where people are in a lot of the world. I mean, just, you could adopt, like in Latin America, you could adopt the American Constitution, you could have La Casa Rosa instead of the White House, but what do you get? Seedy autocracy. You don't get checks and balances at all, and yet they're written almost word for word into your fundamental law. It's a tough business, and that's also why I always, you know, if you have it, don't throw it away, because you'll miss it when it's gone.
Let me pick that up. A lot of what you said seems to suggest a sort of historical inevitability, yet clearly that's not the case. So after the wars, what happened? Was this a sabotage because of post-war consensus, a failure of virtue, a failure of vitality? What caused the inevitable to be inevitable?
Well, my first order response is that government in Britain got big, right? Liberty is power. The British ceased to be free. I mean, they'd had rationing. Yeah, okay, that's why it's just the first order answer. What happened to the British? Were they tired? Were they deluded? Was the spirit of the age against them? Had they been consumed from within by relativism? Stay tuned for Wednesday's lecture, because to some extent that's going to be my answer.
I just recently watched Wartime Farm, the classic BBC docudrama on how the nation fed itself during World War II. And I looked at that and said, you know what? You should have gave up. You would have kept your freedom under the Germans, because you became them.
Well, I mean, and another thing, remember, during the early part of the war, the British government suddenly realized that the prospect of invasion was very real, and that they shouldn't have disarmed their people to the extent they had. And they even appealed to the Americans, send the British guns, right? And George Orwell has this piece about how the rifle hanging on the wall of the laborer's hut is a symbol of freedom, and we must keep it there. But as soon as the war was over, the government took the guns back, and the people were like, fine, take the guns back. You should rule over us, tell us what to do, ration our sugar. So there was a kind of collapse of morale that was dramatic. And it's odd, too, because, of course, the British winning World War II is one of the most improbable feats in all of history. Admittedly, they had some help from the United States, but that wouldn't have been amounted to much had they succumbed prior to Pearl Harbor, or even in the 6 or 7 months afterward when the Americans couldn't give them much practical help. You'd think a people who'd done that would be very pleased with what they'd done and how they'd done it, but apparently they weren't. I remember George MacDonald Fraser writing about this. I think it's in his book about, he was in the war in Burma right at the end, but he says, you'll see somebody sitting in an office in Britain in 1954, bored to tears, frustrated with their life, snapping a pencil and going, I wish the war were still on. But it's an odd combination of things, and one of them I think maybe was exhaustion. The British simply exhausted themselves with the exertions necessary to stand up to Hitler and still be, I mean, don't forget, until D-Day, the British had more men in the field than the United States did. That's hard to believe. That's an incredible performance, but I think maybe to some extent it burned them out. But I think that also the currents in British politics since at least the 1870s toward more government had a pernicious impact. If you could make the government in Britain small again, I think you might find the nation revived surprisingly quickly. But, try and get people to believe these days that we should get rid of the big social programs, and they look at you like you've got three heads. But we absolutely should do that.
The government exists to take care of us, and that's what was inculcated into the British soul in the wars. The government takes care of us, the government dictates, and that has been the post-war consensus ever since. During COVID, you talk to a normal person, and the government will take care of us. And that has been the downfall of the freedoms model of stumbling from blessing to blessing ever since. We have a false god.
I guess this is interesting for me since I grew up in a highly nostalgic home of World War II. My mom was in the civilian in the Canadian Air Force working. My dad was civilian working at an R&R place in Lebanon as a Syrian kid. And the effort and the value of it, even though my uncle got killed in the war as a pilot, seemed like there was so much invested, and maybe it was some sort of fatigue. At the same time, I grew up in a Dutch community in Illinois that seriously has been able to perpetuate the faith like no other. And that was an interesting thing, is that there's still people going in the Dutch where I grew up. It was, even though I'm not Dutch, I was only non-Dutch in the school in my class. They didn't wait for the government to educate their kids, and that's still going on to this day. That tradition of we do it ourselves, and of course it's at a higher level than public school, and it's at a higher level than the Catholics could do, because it keeps going. So don't diminish the Dutch. They were just a little underwater piece of land.
On a per capita basis, we're better than the English.
And so anyway, I think it's being spent, because when I was a kid and go to Manitoba in the summer, it seemed like a spiritual vacuum. I mean, like the kids that we had spent time around, like in the summers, it's like they seem, and I was just, 10 years old, it's like there's something wrong here.
Yeah, and it's fun.
Canada is pretty spiritually vacant.
Yeah, and in Ontario, for instance, the first form of self-government among the settlers was school boards. We didn't wait for the government; we did it ourselves. But yeah, something has gone wrong. Although again, the British voted for Brexit, right? So they're not dead yet, but they're not looking well. Yeah, but only from the summer of 41 on, right? By which point the British had held Hitler off alone for a year. And without Lend-Lease, the Russians would have lost for sure. Yeah, so a lot of things went right. But again, if the French had been in the British Isles and the English had been on the European continent, I think the French would have held out after Britain fell. I don't see it. It's a bit counterfactual, but...
He really had great admiration how they administered the empire, and he actually wanted them to have a truce. He was very interested in not actually invading him. But of course, the Battle of Britain, that whole Arab thing that went on where he started bombing cities, and that reversed everything. And probably, if that hadn't happened, Britain may have lost. There's been many situations where Britain was on the very edge of losing.
Yeah, I know. I've said before that if the Second World War had not happened and you wrote it as your magnum opus and sent it off to a publisher, they would insist that you tone it down. including that Britain should have lost. You've got to give Britain more at the beginning of the war, or you can't have them survive. It's just too improbable. Too many things have to happen that just wouldn't happen. But at the same time, the free people have been winning victories against long odds for 2,500 years. And at some point, you have to think there's something about liberty that builds a winning streak. Because even Salamis and so on, the Greeks shouldn't have won that battle, and yet they did. Or the Romans losing at Cannae, they should have thrown in the towel, but instead they won the Punic Wars. There is something, the gates of Vienna, time and again it happens, and you can always look at specifics that seem, okay, well, this is why it happened, or that's why it happened. And what if the Poles hadn't stolen the Enigma machine, right? Would the British have lost the war? Quite possibly, it seems that way. But freedom is the horse to bet on. It wins races where it looks like it's going to lose them, and tyranny loses races it looks like it's going to win. And by the way, Franklin Roosevelt is not a hero of mine. I think he was a devious man with a muddled mind. But at the time that the British were hunting the Bismarck, which obviously is another of these critical points in the war where they got quite lucky, not least after bombing their own ship, which is probably not a good idea under the circumstances. Roosevelt had sent the USS New York, it's a pretty obsolete battleship, into the Atlantic, sailing a contrary course to the Bismarck, and I'm pretty sure he was hoping the Bismarck would sink it, and then they could have come into the war a year earlier. So other things could have happened the other way, but at the same time, I think God loves freedom. I think it's the only explanation for the kind of metaphysics of geopolitics that we haven't succumbed to tyranny centuries or even millennia ago. That there even is political freedom is odd.
So, you got cycles in different realms of life. So you've got economic cycles, and you have bacteria that start off and they're growing exponentially, and then they're drowned out by their own toxic byproducts, and then the population stabilizes, and then you've got in the Old Testament, the people of God are enslaved, and then they cry out, and then they conquer, and now they forget about God. Do you think this was kind of like the perfect storm of some of that, like Victorian England, like? Okay, we're coming off of feudalism and the Middle Ages or whatever, and now we've got technology, we've got this idea of freedom. Do you think it was kind of like they almost became a victim of their own success leading into World War I and some of that?
Well, I do, but I also think, and that's what I'm going to be talking about on Wednesday, that the intellectual and philosophical and theological roots go deeper than historical accident, that there are things that tend to undermine belief in truth that are very powerful and have an internal logic. They may be mistaken, but they're not random. And that I think that those things eat away at Western civilization in such a way that I think it's now happening in the United States and in Canada as well. I mean, in Canada, the rot's obvious. But one of the things about the United States, it's only in the last, I think, 15 years or thereabouts, that church-going and partisan preference have begun to correlate. Throughout American history, Democrats and Republicans were equally likely to go to church, but now they're not. The United States has been an outlier in being a Christian nation in reality as well as in name, but increasingly it's not. And if it falls, the torch of freedom has passed from Greece to Rome to England to the United States, but you guys, there's no one else. Okay, you can't pass it further west. There's nobody waiting, so please don't drop it. And I don't think you can have an atheist people can't be free, right? We're in an appalling spiritual crisis, which, if you like hard work, is good news. But again, I remember there's a line from The Lord of the Rings where I think it's when Frodo was saying that he wished he hadn't lived to see these times, and Gandalf, so do all who live through them. But we can't decide that. All we can decide to do is what to do with the situation that faces us. And again, I hope that what I have to say on Wednesday will be of some help in seeing why we're in this mess.
So, speaking of passing the torch on, so now you've got the Muslims, taking over most of Europe and the U.S. and Canada and a lot of other places too, but then you also have these other people that have immigrated to the U.S. and Europe, and they're looking for those opportunities. I think you're already starting to see a little bit of that. Like, they're the ones that are going to carry
carry the torch on once the Caucasians all decide to stop repopulating and having children and, eventually go extinct, then, the Latinos and whoever else are going to be the ones that, once they're in their countries that have opportunities, maybe they're the ones that are going to step up and take on that torch of freedom.
Well, yeah, I mean, freedom's not a race, right? The Greeks and Romans weren't Caucasian, and there's plenty of people who love liberty from every part of the world, including people who at one point it was said, oh, they're not fit for freedom, and then you discover that they're actually remarkably fit for it. So there are all kinds of hopeful signs. I mean, one of the things about the Islamists, I have written about this, their tendency to try and take the pot with a pair of fours. It's remarkable how they overestimate their strength. So if we can get our act together, the situation is far from lost. But if we, somebody said great civilizations die from suicide, not murder. And that's, in a way, to me, is one of the critical things. If we choose to be free and faithful, then we'll be okay. If we don't, nothing can save us. But this really is in our hands. And that, in a sense, is good news. I mean, it's sort of a drag when God looks around and points at you and says, here, you do it. And you're like, surely you have somebody more plausible as a candidate. Like, what are you talking about? But the finger keeps pointing at you. And you're like, okay, Lord, well, then help me out here because I have no clue what I'm doing. But that's where we are, right? And again, one of the things I've always thought about the world and about one of the reasons I became Christian is that it's clear that it's an adventure. It's a preposterous adventure. It's a laugh out loud adventure, but at the same time, it's very serious business. And apparently we have been appointed to do this task. So God knows what he's doing, even when we can't quite suss it out. So, one of the things, again, about the Lord of the Rings or the Narnia Chronicles or so on is that it's somewhat clearer what we're meant to do, right? So that if only we lived in a world where the day-to-day choices weren't a little harder to quite see where does Aslan, what does he, but, no use complaining, right? Job tried that. And again, in a sense, I think we do have a better sense. Sometimes you don't want to see it because it looks like hard work, but, that line from Victoria about the Bible, right? Well, one of the things that I think we need more of in this society is people saying, if you have a problem, read the Bible, because that's God's word. And even people who are supposedly defenders of the faith often don't do that. There was just a piece in the paper today about was it Germany, I think, and the president of the local archbishop were at a church where they were doing some piece of theater with chickens in diapers. And do you not stand up and walk out? Like, does the local archbishop not excommunicate the Catholic prime minister who defends abortion and euthanasia? What on earth is going on here? What are people waiting for? Are you going to live to be 700 and you can, like, when you hit 500, you're going to start standing up for things? But at the moment, I don't know what the lawn needs mowing. It's odd to me, but maybe I'm just a belligerent person. But I really think that part of it is just that we have to get back to talking like Joseph Howe, when he talked about the sacred fire of liberty, right? Not just the fire of liberty, but the sacred fire of liberty. We should be using that kind of language, and we should be acting like this was real. This wasn't just some words in an old book, that this is actually what's happening. And we, however unlikely it may seem, we are actually the ones right now holding that torch. And again, John McCrae's In Flanders Fields may not be famous outside Canada, but it's one of the things that should be. I don't know if Mordecai Rishley is a Canadian humorist who coined the phrase world famous in Canada. And it's a deadly phrase. But when the dead say, to you with failing hands, we throw the torch, be yours to hold it high. And it's so this torch arrives in your hand. You're like, what? But there it is, right? There's no arguing there. There it is in your hand, and you're not allowed to drop it in the puddle. You're not allowed to pretend it's not a torch. It is, and you're the one holding it. And here we are. So this is why I find that so many conservative politicians are so timid about defending freedom and so timid about defending decency. And again, I don't understand what they want on their tombstone. Maybe I should have said something. That's not the epitaph you're looking for. It just isn't. It can't be. So, as I was saying, let's be happy warriors. Let's get into this fight, and let's remember what worked in the past and what people did and why it was good, and let's do our best to recreate it suitably to this current occasion.
Well, school teachers that, made us speak English and they made us, well, okay, yes, I understand, like there might have been oppression at some point, but at the same time, you learned English and now you have a museum that you were able to write your history in English. So it's a mixed bag at best, or at worst, I'd say. There probably was oppression, but at the same time, there are a lot of benefits that came from, the British and the American, development, colonialism, if you want to put it that way. But I don't know where I was going with that. But,
Yeah, but I want to ask those people, so are you not teaching your kids English? And in fact, as some of you may know, I've had this thing recently where I have a hip replaced and then I go to a dangerous foreign country. And in the fall, it was Azerbaijan, which was actually less dangerous than I anticipated. But Azerbaijan was very strange in this regard. Like, as you may gather, the language in Azerbaijan is Azerbaijani. And you will not, I think, in your entire life run into anybody who speaks Azerbaijani who isn't from Azerbaijan. But I have also never been anywhere, except maybe when I was backpacking in rural Nepal many decades ago, where fewer people spoke any English or any other language. About 10% of the older people spoke some Russian, because Azerbaijan was part of the Soviet Union for a long time, and it shows. But the cab drivers could not say hello, yes, and no in English. In the hotel that I was staying at, ordering dinner was a nightmare because they didn't speak a word of English. I spoke about 5 words of Azerbaijani, and they had a phone app for translating from Azerbaijani to English that spewed gibberish. At one point, they typed in what the menu was, and it came out with the words powerless sovereignty in it. And I don't eat powerless sovereignty. Never have, never will. And so finally, I would punch into my app, bring me anything, everything you have is good, and they would bring me grilled lamb and so on, and it was all good. But one time I got into a taxi, and the cab driver, Nazim, actually turns and looks at me, which is, again, it practically has not happened the whole time I've been there. And he looked, and sort of desperately, he says, "Speak Spanish?" And I say, "Oh, un pocacito." And we proceed to speak in Spanish because he'd spent years at the embassy in Madrid or something like that. But how the heck do you expect to get anywhere in the world other than where you are now in Azerbaijan, where the word for wolf is canavar, because they've still got them and they eat the sheep. And what the sheep eat, I have no idea, because that grass didn't look like you could feed a mouse on it. But because at one point we wanted to take some pictures of a shepherd, so our guide asks the shepherd if it's okay if the wacko foreigners take pictures of you, and the guy goes, "Yeah, okay, but tell him not to get out of the car because my dog will eat them," right? Like, this guy has a serious wolf-devouring dog. So this is a tough life, right? These guys are making it happen and under very difficult circumstances, and they don't speak any English. And it's like, you may think it's a shame that English is the lingua franca. You may wish history had been different 300 years ago, but it wasn't, right? English is the language of elites everywhere. Even when I was in Senegal, right, the official language of Senegal is French, but it's only spoken by about a quarter of the population. And that's maybe half in the big cities and maybe 3% elsewhere. And maybe 10% can do something in English. But most of them speak a language called Wolof. And again, you are not going to meet Wolof speakers anywhere in the world except if you bump into somebody who's from Senegal. It's just not going to happen. So and in Senegal, they get this. You've got to learn French and you've got to try and learn English. And that's just how the world is. And so for these Aboriginal people, if the Europeans had never showed up, how do you conceive that you would now be living? And why is that so much better than the way that you and your children can live today with your cell phones and your automobiles and your furnaces and, material things? Money doesn't buy happiness, but it gets you some stuff.
I have an answer for that. Because if you don't have a universal language, you're forced to honor your fathers and remember what went before, and life continues in a very communitarian fashion. You have institutional memory. Once you have a lingua franca, you break all local bonds, and life is just a series of instances, and you move from pragmatism to pragmatism.
Well, I do take that point,
My working theory.
but at the same time, I assume that you raised your kids to speak English. So
And Dutch, and French.
yeah, which is good too. But
And my oldest Latin, because she saw, what's this alphabet at age 5 or 6? Well, that's the Greek. So now, of course, she's the Latin prof at UOL. And she knows Coptic and
Bona est filia tua, but still she speaks English.
I'm just surprised that Dutch triumphalism has made itself evident here. So I wouldn't expect
So what has?
Dutch triumph.
Oh, yeah, I know.
I'm more on Robson's Highland Berserker side of things than I am on the lowlands.
Well, and it's funny too, because of course Dutch is a language that cannot be pronounced. Though when I was going to Senegal, by the way, I did a little research into Wolof, and Wolof apparently the verbs don't have tenses. You do that with the pronouns, which told me several things. First of which is you're not going to learn any of this in the next 3 weeks, so never mind. Secondly, if you go to Senegal, don't ask someone their pronouns because you'll be there for 3 days, but you won't know whether it's in the future or the past. But again, it's like certain languages are very, very hard to learn. Azerbaijani, I think, was somewhat more straightforward. But again, it's, I like a world of strong local identities. This galactic metropolis where everywhere's the same as everywhere else bugs me. But when you see the places that haven't become like that, it's not usually for good reasons. And like the parts of Senegal where you can't get by in English or French, they also have no electricity. And while I'm all for the simple life, the problems of not having electricity in the 21st century are generally pretty grim. Not least because Senegal is absolutely and totally, at least everywhere we went, is full of plastic trash. And if you're going to have the plastic trash, you might as well have the English language.
Don't want to think about like the noble savage, but the flip side of it is where we are today is worse than living without electricity for kids growing up because they run a shuttle bus from the hospital emergency room to psychiatric hospitals now in our town.
So they run a shuttle bus?
Shuttle bus from kids to go from the emergency room to the psych hospital.
Oh, well, that's convenient.
Well, I'm just saying that there's more misery now than you can imagine. Losing your dad is worse than the best month of my life was without electricity.
Well, yeah, and I grew up with this cottage up on Georgian Bay without electricity. Nearest road was 7 miles away. We didn't have an indoor toilet, and it was paradise. But on the other hand, if somebody got sick, you could phone for a water taxi.
But I'm not saying that it's better, but just to keep that in perspective, that things have gotten so out of hand now. And the relief for me is I don't have to go and visit the kids anymore and then try and place them. They just leave them sitting there until they get placed. Saves me a lot of sleep, but it's not good.
Yeah, and actually, in the course, the lecture before this one is about the Industrial Revolution, and it starts out with this sort of rapid increase in productive wealth, and people get better clothing and stoves and so on, and then you get mustard gas, and you get nuclear bombs, and you get artificial intelligence, and I say to the students, I have a solution for every problem I'm going to tell you about in this course. Some of them may seem implausible, some will be hard to implement, some I'm not having much luck building a consensus. So I've got a solution for everything except the increasing pace of technology. And the only solution I have for that is the second coming. And, the sooner the better, because it just, the AI and this kind of stuff, man, if you could get rid of AI by getting rid of electricity, then it would be a deal worth making. The trouble is you can't. Some fool will just build it again. And the pace of technology, even this, like it's everyone a co-pilot. Microsoft wants me to have Copilot. I do not want to have Copilot. I got on fine without Copilot. I got it was okay with a manual typewriter. I sort of like the editing software for the AV, but this AI stuff, and this thing about this appears to be a long document, save time by reading a summary, right? So someone has to write an email. They write 3 bullet points. The AI turns it into a long email. They send it off. The other person's AI turns it back into bullet points. But the fact is the AI is probably better at the job than either of these people. So what are they meant to do? It's just, it's ghastly. But you can't put the genie back in the bottle. And that's a scary thought, but I think you just can't. Sorry, one.
So, did the idea of utopia kind of emerge at this time, or is that already around before then?
Well, Thomas More wrote a utopia. But though mostly, of course, utopias are designed to prove that it can't be done. Then you start to get some silly ones like Edward Bellamy's Looking Backwards and so on, where people really do think you could have a utopia. By the way, some of you have heard me in the past, and I did mention tonight Nero Wolfe as one of my favorite fictional detectives. If you've not read the Nero Wolfe stories, I really heartily recommend them. And at one point, the narrator mentions that Wolfe had gotten rid of his copy of Utopia because he thought Thomas More had helped frame Richard III. And since I'm sort of a halfway member of the Richard III Society, I figure anybody who's against the Tudor usurpers is my kind of person. But again, I can't figure out how to undo that. Like how we get the House of York back on the throne. Maybe Canada needs its own monarch, some people think. So maybe we could find somebody from the House of York, although again, the Tudors should have exterminated everybody. They were that kind of people. So every age has had its discontents, by the way. It sometimes comforts me. Things are so bad today, and then I think, yeah, but they were pretty bad under Henry VIII too. And Henry VII was no bargain, and Henry VI was insane. Henry V died young. Henry IV was all right, I guess. Henry III was feeble. Henry II was scary. But again, we are in 2025, and we need to get back to as much of the Victorian era as we can. And I think that my remarks on Wednesday will help to illuminate just why that's so desperately urgent and also why it's so difficult. So I think we'll wrap up the formal part now, and then if you haven't had far too much of me, we can just carry on at the table.